don't think I could convince people that I have a perspective big enough to represent an entire district. And if I can't do that, I'm wondering, what kind of experiences
I've worked for people who are substantially older than I am now. I'm 44, and I've worked for people who are substantially younger. And I always like working for the older people better. They seem to have a better perspective on things.
You're a Republican. That's kind of how that goes. Yeah.
That is true.
Welcome to the Georgia Politics Podcast. It is April 1st, 2019. I am Preston Thompson. We are bringing you a special episode on a Monday, the Monday before the final day of the legislative session. So we've got a couple things we're going to touch on. We're going to hit every big issue, at least a little bit, and try and get everybody out of here before Monday afternoon traffic. Let's go around the room. Let everybody know at home who is here. To my left is...
This is Craig Kidd, first vice chairman of the Fulton County Republican Party and chief of staff to the mayor of Johns Creek.
Hi, I'm Carson Cook. I am a reporter with Appen Media Group and a fellow podcaster.
I'm Hans Appen, Appen Media Group, Appen Podcast Network. And Carson, I believe you used to cover, was it the Tennessee State Legislature?
No.
No? What was it?
She was from Chattanooga.
I'm from Tennessee, but I've only ever covered local politics or community news.
Okay, well, I had that wrong.
Our resident North Fulton news.
Were you
reporter.
lying
Sorry,
on your resume
I was
then?
not. It sounds like I was,
This isn't-
but
yeah.
I never claimed to have covered the
I was-
You don't hear
we
much
Tennessee
about the
legislature.
Tennessee
We need to
legislature.
talk
I can't
later.
remember reading a single story.
While
about
we're
it.
going through resumes, I was also never chief of staff to the vice president. I should go ahead and let you know. I did lie on that line of my resume when I asked for this hosting job.
I'm
know
going to
what?
post my
I'm
resume
done.
to Twitter later to prove.
April Fools, none of us are qualified. All right, let's get into it. So, an issue that came up for the first time this last week in the House had already been passed through the Senate. Senate Bill 77, Monument Protection. This was one of the more interesting back and forth debates we've had on the House floor. I'm excited to see how we can get into it, where everybody stands on it. Two main facets of this bill. The first one would increase penalties for monument defamation. That's kind of a vague word in quotes, but generally the presenter was putting pictures up on screens of people having spray painted over things and things like that.
Mhm.
That was the part I think most everybody agreed with. I think if that bill was a standalone, I think most people would have passed, would have had maybe 10 dissenting votes, something like that. The second element of it prohibited the second element of it prohibited removing monuments unless placing them in a place of similar prominence, I think it was called. So if you're going to remove a statue from somewhere, you have to put it in a place of equal or greater community value, like the Main Street corner or something like that. This was taken by most of the people on the House floor to be a bill that protected Confederate monuments and took away power from local control. So first, I want to ask, does this take away certain elements of local communities' ability to handle these issues for themselves?
Of course it does.
I mean, it does literally, but there has to. But that would be like saying the state taking land for a state park would be taking local control from that county or that city. I mean, the state does have some role and some responsibility in certain aspects of property.
Sure. A lot. By the way, a lot of these monuments
Like
do
House Bill
sit.
302?
I'm sorry.
Like
House Bill 302.
Wasn't that the state?
Thank God.
That
it's-
was the
Regarding
state, and
property?
thank God that was
It's dead and will
quote
never
unquote
come back.
defeated.
Yeah.
Well, it will come back because it's got too many powerful people behind it.
Yeah,
But no,
House
but
Bill
that
302 redefined building guidelines
design
for local
guidelines.
communities and
sure.
had unanimous support against it from the GMA,
GMA
the
was,
Georgia
yes.
Municipal Association.
Yes, that
Yeah.
was full on board, grenades ready to
Yeah.
go, kind of opposition.
Yeah.
And they did an excellent job of quashing it.
So, but what about this one? Isn't the same amount of taking away that local control? A lot of these monuments are in local parks or public areas that are run by either the city or the county.
Mhm.
What is it about a community? If a community is 85% minority and they don't want this statue in their community, then they should be able to get it out. And if a community has living descendants of somebody who's being recognized from a Civil War monument, and the community is behind that staying there, they should be able to keep it. That was the general argument from the Democratic Party caucus, along with some other language about how the law was too vague. But
I think if we've demonstrated anything, at least in the limited number of shows that I've done here during this legislative session, is that the relationship between the state and local governments is convoluted, complicated, and tenuous. I think a lot of times it just boils down to the specific issue. I mean, local rights are always great, but the older I get, the more I sort of realize that, if you're in favor of what the end is going to be, then you're against local control.
Sure.
But if the local control protects what you believe in, you're all in favor of local control.
Well, and
the process is subservient to your ideology, and I think that works on every party and every political perspective.
Well, and there's a sense that these legislators can't look beyond their own district too, saying, "Oh, well, if this passed, this would help my district keep this thing."
Yeah,
but for a law like this that has a blanket over the entire state, I think there's an inability to look past that.
It's very complicated because you're right. I mean, if there's something in a public park in Decatur, that's Decatur public land, but it's also land in Georgia.
Sure.
And it reminds me of the kid and the adult. Well, this is my room, but yes, this is my house. That age-old complaint. And again, it's ideology is trumping the local rights perspective, I think.
Well, I was thinking a little bit about this over the weekend, and I thought that this one in particular does. I think it strikes me as the monuments are a representation of a period of time or of a person that has some sort of historical importance to that community. So something that I use the example of Roswell. Roswell's one of, if not the oldest city in the state, and it has statues and houses that have a lot of historical context. Now, the city of Roswell, they're going to value those things much differently than someone in Augusta would or Savannah would. And I think the citizens of Roswell are much better in tune with whether that monument or whatever it may be has enough historical significance that it should remain. And that's kind of what I was thinking, was just that it takes far to the scope of it is so small to that community that I think the state really has no.
I don't want to say every statue is different, but there has to be maybe it's a difference between a statue and a marker. Like saying a statue in the center of Decatur. Decatur was a significant area in the Battle of Atlanta, in the Confederacy's defense of Atlanta. Does that statue mark the perseverance of the Confederate soldier, or does it mark the acknowledgement that a significant part of that battle occurred there?
Yeah, this was
I'm not prepared to answer that question. Frankly, I don't think half the legislators could either.
Right. Well, this was a point I was trying to make too. Is there are, I don't want to repeat what you just said, but there are fields out in the South that are marked as points of battle where the Confederacy won, where the Confederacy advanced their position and came closer to winning the war. So is that a memorial? I think most people would say no, but a statue of Jefferson Davis that has some inscription, hypothetically, look at this powerful man, whatever it is, that is a memorial. So the problem is, you're right, it is a case-by-case thing that has to be dealt with by nuanced. And what we're not considering too, and one of the presenting arguments was, when you start trying to, this is a popular argument with people who present this, when you start trying to rewrite history or whitewash history, where does it end? A lot of people disagreed with the Vietnam War. Are we going to tear down Vietnam War memorials? But I think what that argument is missing is the context in which these memorials were built in the first place.
Like Stone Mountain?
Right. Again, marking the plot of land where a battle occurred is different than an organization putting up a statue in 1934 in Charleston to remind people about where they almost lived, essentially.
You're right. And we have a very impressive Veterans Memorial Walk in Johns Creek. I presume everybody around the table here has seen it. I don't know, Preston, if you have. It's in Newtown Park. And there are monuments to every war starting in the 20th century. They're including the Vietnam War, which I think we can all agree is the most controversial of that century. And my father has a brick there. My father was the chief fundraiser for that walk. And if anybody ever tries to denigrate or to vandalize that particular or any part of that walk, I mean, he better hope that person isn't there while I'm there. Now, to the point that you had just made, that 50 years from now, when my son is older, I don't know if he'll have that same perspective, but I hope that they recognize that memorial still needs to stand because it recognizes the sacrifices of men and women.
So what makes the Civil War different than that we don't have that perspective? Is it that it's just a war on our own soil?
It's slavery.
Slavery just
It's slavery.
just is.
It's slavery.
Because there were a lot of horrors of the Vietnam War that will seep in with deeper time, and you're right, maybe the perspective will change, but
it's funny. I've mentioned this one of the earlier ones. I mean, I'm from New York. I have no love for the Confederacy. Whenever I see a Civil War movie, whenever the Confederates get mowed down, I cheer.
I would like to think a lot of people would.
But at the same time, when I walk by a Confederate statue, I don't jeer at it. But again, I'm not African American, so
Sure.
I recognize there's a difference. This is a real big picture thing. I always like statues. Whenever I see a Confederate statue, it always reminds me about how different America is. The American Civil War may be the only civil war in human history where the loser still gets to memorialize itself. It occurred to me that, the English Civil War, there's no representation anywhere of the losing side. When the Romans had their Civil War, Mark Antony versus Octavian, when Mark Antony lost, the entire family was wiped out. You couldn't even name any children Marcus after Mark Antony. So we in America are so very different that we still get to let the loser still write books about their cause, put up statues. There was no effort after these statues were being put up in the 1890s of the North coming back down and ripping them up saying, no, you're representing a lost cause, you can't do it. They let them do it. And that's the way I look at some of these statues. It shows how America is very different from history, which I kind of like.
So
I've got one too.
I agree with most of what you're saying there. They can be symbols of how far we've come and how much we've changed. But again, I think that disregards a lot of the context of why they were put there in the first place. And we have mechanisms for showing that kind of thing, like museums or battle scenes, or like you said, markers.
Mm-hmm.
A memorial, just the very word of it, memorialize. I mean, it's a new context of what we're attributing to. And I think it's something that should be remembered and should be taught. And this whole notion that when we start removing Confederate statues, we're going to forget about the Civil War somehow. They teach World War II in Germany. They don't have Nazi flags everywhere. Like, there is a middle ground here, and dealing with the nuance of it is certainly the most difficult part.
Well, you mentioned World War II. That the thought occurred to me that an older example before Vietnam, I think the United States dropping of the atom bomb, as time has gone by, that seems to have become a much darker decision with historical context. So I think that's interesting. How much does any kind of World War II memorial, how does the opinion on that change over the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Historians come in groups. Opinions about wars and campaigns and historical figures differ. Mm-hmm. Andrew Jackson was the most viled president in history in the late 19th century, and then a couple of authors and a couple books came out in the early 20th centuries, and suddenly Jackson was a savior, was a god. The term Jacksonian American resurfaced,
and even more recently,
now once again he's going back down because of the Trail of Tears and and the other 19th century issues. So much that he's now being removed from a dollar bill, or a lot of people wanted to. So things go up and down in that regard. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying we'll ever reach the point where the Confederacy is revered, but maybe in 50 years from now, it won't be as much of a sensitive issue.
But again, sorry, go ahead.
As you said, a statue can be interpreted differently by different people. and that the way a statute is interpreted depends both on the historical context that it represents, the historical context under which it is enacted, and the historical context we're living under now.
Mm-hmm.
If it's so much nuance and contextual, does it not make sense to have it at the most local level?
Yes.
Where they have the best beat on the community that the statute represents? Because I just kind of wanted to go back to the local level thing, because I think it's been a reoccurring theme of this legislative session. I brought up HB 302. We're going to talk about the airport later. With those examples, not saying that I agree with the legislation, but I can hear an argument of why it should be controlled at the state level. The airport affects the economy of the entire state. The building design legislation, that affects the construction industry throughout the entire state, and home prices throughout the entire state, which then in turn affects the workforce throughout the entire state. If someone wants to make this argument, I'd love to hear it. I don't see how the overriding state argument for this. I'm not affected by what statues are on display in Savannah.
The idea of state image came up, at least in a couple arguments of, but only in negative context. Somebody, Representative Betsy Holland from Buckhead, stood up and asked questions, and Representative Holland, in her line of work, I believe, recruits companies to Georgia and asks them to bring their workforce here as part of what she does. And she was saying, this plays into what people think of Georgia, like what people think we are and what we're displayed as in political cartoons from the New Yorker or whatever it is. I mean, so that's the only thing I took away as this is why the state should control it, because it's a state issue. But again, like Craig was saying, I think that way because if the state controlled it in my favor, meaning we're going to get rid of them all, then I get happier. But again, I have
That goes back to Craig's point that it's all about ideology.
And my ends justify the means on that. Yeah.
And I find it a bit ironic that Betsy Holland made that point, who represents Buckhead, where there has to be at least 9 or 10 markers, Civil War markers in that district.
Markers are different. We already talked about that.
Yeah, but some of those, sit and read those markers. Some of them praise Confederate action in that marker. So are we going to tear down that marker because it praised that the 3rd South Carolina Infantry Division was able to push back on
maybe
McPherson's Corps? I mean,
it goes back to case by case, right? Because there's a marker outside my apartment that says this is where a base was. Cool. I don't know. Okay. But it's cool. I like it. I like feeling like that history is kind of all around me. What I wouldn't like is somebody who wanted to change my community for the worse, kind of looking down on me in a memorial, not a marker. So I think that makes it different.
So how much was Stone Mountain a part of these conversations?
Well, there was an interesting comment from a legislator who, I forget his name, I'm sorry, a Republican, who basically went up and said, I almost brought this amendment to the floor. He did not, but he wanted to talk about it anyways. That would have asked for...
I hate when they do that.
Well, and you'll understand why in a second. It would have asked for a plaque to be put on the base of Stone Mountain that read, and I'm paraphrasing here because I do not have this in front of me, that read, here lies Stone Mountain that was built, funded, and designed by Democrats. And that was the essentialness of it.
Jesus.
That was I think the context in which Stone Mountain got put into this.
Wow.
Now was there anything about this would protect Stone Mountain from getting sandblasted or anything I don't think that ever came up at all, at least in the public testimony. I never heard Stone Mountain get mentioned as something that had the potential to be altered or anything.
I don't think Stone Mountain needs any extra legal protection. They're pretty well ensconced right now.
Well, that's a conversation for another day. It's there aren't many monuments to the Confederacy in the state right now that have a theme park surrounding them. So I think it's just a completely different animal to tackle.
I guess I don't want to belabor the point, but we have a park down in South Central Georgia, Jefferson Davis Park. They may go by another name. It's the spot where Jefferson Davis was captured by Union troops. So do we keep that park because it represents the action of a positive because Jeff Davis was captured, or do we get rid of it because it mentions Jeff Davis at all? It mentions the
I think
Confederacy.
I think that's
So-
a great argument that I hope the county could have and make that decision for themselves, because I have no
I
perspective
don't know
on
if
that.
I would want the county to have the only perspective on an issue that has such overarching and overwhelming historic issue on that.
Well, and I brought up Stone Mountain because I think it's interesting that we're discussing park names or monuments or markers when we have Confederate soldiers literally etched onto the face of a
Sure.
mountain here in the state
Sure.
of Georgia.
It doesn't get much bigger than that.
Right, right.
Atlanta has been changing street names, has been changing statues, changing names of parks for a while, kind of slowly but surely. If this bill gets signed into law, do you think this could come to a point where maybe not Atlanta, but a city challenges the law and says this should be our authority to do this, to rename this street, to move this statue or anything like that?
Well, is there also potential room for challenge in the wording of the law? I don't know what it is exactly,
Yes.
but the idea of a place of equal or greater prominence seems pretty subjective.
It's vague. I think Galloway had a humorous point about that in one of his comments, that they moved the statue of Governor Watson, who ran for president as a populist. He was a long-term legislator. He was the one with the arm like this.
Yeah.
And it was supposed to be moved to a point of prominence, and now it's apparently in a side park a couple blocks away from the Capitol, where nobody goes.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
so already the prominence term has been abused or set aside, if you will.
Sure. And there is language too on who, like, what member of the population can
Not Ben
sue,
Watson.
can legally challenge these things. And Josh McLaurin, who is a pretty smart lawyer and understands this stuff a lot better than I do, got up and in his testimony said the way this law is written, either everybody can sue or nobody can sue. And that's not typically how you want these laws to be written. You want some more specificity. So I do think there is some challenge there, and it could be, I don't remember who I was talking to, but somebody says this seems like the sort of thing where it gets signed into law, the city challenges it, and the courts strike it down as too vague, and they had their excellent PR moment of protecting Confederate history, and everybody moves on with their lives.
Could a city make an argument that their ability to put down or take down a monument is a constitutional right in free speech representing their constituents?
That is not a question I'm qualified to answer. But maybe.
Maybe.
I don't know.
You'll find a lawyer willing to give it a shot.
Yeah, I was going to say. There's a lot of lawyers in this town, and they all like to try different things. All right, let's move on to another issue. That did pass, by the way, basically on party lines. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was about
not a single Dem voted for it.
Right. So, moving on. House Bill 481 had its last hearing in the legislature this week. We have talked about it over and over again. That is the heartbeat bill that would ban abortions past 6 weeks. I want to talk about a different element of it that has changed since the last time we talked, which is activism coming from the business community and from the, for lack of a better word, the Hollywood community. I feel like I need to say that in a thick Southern accent because that's how I've heard it all these weeks. Do we want
Hollywood.
these Hollywood types telling us how to
This
live?
is why you
Yeah.
have the film person on the podcast.
So those two communities, and I don't think really in conjunction with each other, have in some form rallied their support a little bit to tell the governor, do not sign this. There's a list right now of actors and actresses. I think it's hit 75 or so, very prominent names. I think most people, if you read it, would know 50 out of the 75 that have said, we will not come work in Georgia if this is signed into law. Now, we've already talked about how likely or unlikely it is that this actually becomes practiced law, which is not very likely at all. In fact, it's even less likely than last time we talked about it, because Arkansas and I believe Kentucky had similar laws struck down within an hour of them being signed in.
Are you saying
Arkansas
it's not
was-
likely to be practiced?
It's
law?
not likely to be-
Not that it's not likely to be signed.
It will be signed,
Yeah.
and then it will go to court. But does the businesses coming out against it and this movement from the film industry coming out against it, does that change any of the calculation for Governor Kemp enough to not do this?
No.
It was such a staple of his campaign.
He
I don't
campaigned
think
on the strictest abortion laws in the country,
Right.
and this would certainly be that.
Yeah.
And I'd be willing to suggest that very few elections have ever been lost by ranting against the over influence of Hollywood. I mean, when I read that,
Not in this state,
when I
yeah.
read that, well, I mean, anywhere. When I read that quote from Ralston, it reminded me. You laugh, the history guy in me. reminded me every presidential election in recent memory, we have all these stars come out for the Democrat. There's this great documentary about the 2004 presidential race in Ohio. I forget the name of it. And the last 20 minutes of it is they have all these Hollywood stars. Everybody's heard of them. They get on a bus and they're driving around Ohio. It's all about Ohio, talking to everybody on the planet. And then Ohio votes for Bush and swings the election. And then there's all these Hollywood stars going, what happened? What happened? Everybody we talked to loved us. Why didn't they vote the way we asked them to? They didn't get it. It was the same thing, in the 2016 presidential race. Hillary Clinton's last campaign event was a huge concert in Philadelphia where she had Springsteen and Bon Jovi and Lady Gaga, and their convention was filled with Hollywood stars, and yet she lost the election and she lost Pennsylvania, so it didn't even have a local impact if you wanted to play the Springsteen card. So I always sort of laugh when Hollywood thinks they have this ability.
But okay,
What
but
about
they
the
bring
religious
in
liberty bill?
they bring in so much money, and
Right.
when they did threaten to leave over the religious liberty bill, and that industry was threatened even a little bit, the people in the room looked at the economic numbers of this and went, "Oh no!"
Well-
And why is this different than that?
Well, I guess
Well, I'm
I-
not surprised it's different from that, but I was just to Craig's point. I don't think you can say they have zero impact.
Sure, they've
But
already
when
shown they have. At
but
least
when
some.
they do, it is if it's coming more from the economic side, from the studios and the producers that can have the tangential numbers behind it, not from a celebrity tweeting about it.
I am not enough of an entertainment expert to say, but the studios aren't the ones who are coming out and saying we're not going to film here. I haven't heard anything from Warner Brothers or 20th Century Fox. It's the actors and the actresses. So it's the studios that determine where they film, et cetera. And
They need actors and actresses for their movies.
right,
They-
and if they're
they
set
do.
on somebody for a role,
they do, and they may say, look, we're going to save $40 million or whatever a number is if we film here as opposed to filming in Indiana. Alyssa Milano ain't worth $40 million. Find somebody else, and they'll find somebody else. I mean, maybe this is a topic for the movie podcast. The battle between stars and the studios has been
That's a
ongoing.
battle as
has
long
been
as Hollywood itself.
Exactly, since the 1920s, and it seems to me the studios always win.
but you have now studios that film here that need stars because stars are stars of series, and series
Sure.
need to come back with the same actors and actresses unless you can prevent that.
Get
I-
Marvel.
I wouldn't, I agree with you that the studios would certainly carry more weight, but I wouldn't underestimate the bargaining power of the actors and actresses, especially because of the PR element of it. Of if, imagine Alyssa Milano does get passed over for another role so that they can film in Georgia. That doesn't look all that great. And states around us are looking at what Georgia has done with the film industry and are trying to copy. So the governor of Michigan came out earlier this week and said, "Hey, film industry, we're ready for you. Come on over here."
And they'll never go there.
Well, okay, but you have to recognize that the competition is more like we have pretty forests and pretty beaches and we have studio infrastructure now, but is there really that much that is keeping them there to avoid a PR nightmare and getting the star they want?
I'd push back on the idea that they would never go there either. 20 years ago, people would have said they'll never go to Georgia, and then they came to Georgia.
Yeah,
so.
but Michigan is not exactly a state. No, because of the strength of the unions in Michigan, it's a state that is generally not seen as a place that you go to run short-term specific projects.
Well, she ain't the only
That's what-
Democratic governor that
I understand
is
it.
paying
Yeah,
attention
and
to this.
Pennsylvania was another one.
Mhm.
Once again, another heavy union state. I mean, there's a reason why businesses are moving from the north to the south. This is not a short-term issue. This is a generational shift, and there's a lot of reasons that, all the way from the beautiful weather to the right to work and the relatively weak unions. And I think that's also a blessing that Georgia has. I would love to bring this back a year from now and see if if the law gets struck down and never gets fully enacted, that might be the way for everybody to go back to their respective camps and the issue doesn't happen. But I would love to see a year from now if Alyssa Milano et al. Actually film again in Georgia, because Kemp is going to sign the bill, so we'll see what happens. But they might be able to weasel out, for lack of a better term, if a court strikes down the law or puts it on hold.
Sure.
So we'll see. I'd love to bring it back up a year from
Well,
now.
and also, I think it was Hans that brought it up, or was you, Preston, about the series or about the Marvel movies. A lot of those actors are under contract, so I'm not sure how much power they would. I mean, Don Cheadle, I know, is one that signed the list. He's in the Avengers movies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if his contract actually allows him to stipulate where he gets to film.
Sure. Yeah.
Just-
Not
again,
until
I mean,
renegotiation time.
Yeah, I am nowhere near qualified to talk about
Well-
this. It's just the history of it is that actors take these stances, and then it doesn't actually seem to affect the end result.
And for to round it about to the beginning practical question we have, it almost like reignites the fire of Kemp to sign it in the first place. Like, imagine, Kemp is taking a stand against what he would call the liberal progressives, and they keep bringing up the statements made in New York and Virginia. They're taking a stand against that. So then having actors from Hollywood come out and say they're against that, it almost tells Governor Kemp to double down.
It plays incredibly well in Warner Robins.
Right. So it was never going to
this
change.
was something he made clear during his campaign when
Sure.
people tried to ask him about the religious liberty bill.
So on this
is
issue,
that he would be a different kind of governor
Sure.
than Deal was.
and on this issue, he believes he has a mandate, and he won the election for governor, and he has majority in both chambers. So I don't know what you would call that if not a mandate. So
Well, before we move past this, I just want to add, too, that this is not just the film industry we're talking about. There were representatives of Coca-Cola, Delta, Emory University, Amazon, all voicing similar sentiments. So, yes, the film industry in Georgia is a $10 billion industry, but those are some pretty big companies that spend a lot of money in the state. So
yeah, and to Craig's point, this could all get thrown aside because the bill won't become practice law. Now, there is talk of Georgia wants to be the state that brings this to the Supreme Court and gives the Supreme Court the opportunity to talk again about Roe v. Wade. That's a conversation we could probably have 2 years from now, and it would still be undecided. So
I don't think Georgia's the only state that wants that.
I don't
It's
think
gonna
so
be
either.
fighting
But
it out.
they're some of the language about establishing the unborn as official citizens of Georgia is in there for that reason, to try and get it to hold up in court. But anyways, it is signed. It will go to the governor's desk. He will sign it. I don't think there's a lot of that's up in the air right now, but there are still protesters at the Capitol. There's still people trying to mobilize. So maybe he won't, but we'll see. Moving on. The airport takeover bill has taken on a completely new shape. It was morphed by the House side of the Capitol into a larger transportation package that included all sorts of different things and was no longer a takeover, but more of an oversight. It was a half measure that a lot of us on this show had talked about, of a committee that wouldn't necessarily have subpoena power, I don't think, but could talk to people who were involved in suspected criminal activity or actual criminal activity and basically create an oversight committee, which I think a lot of us had thought would be the half measure. The Senate is not going to take that up. This bill could get chopped to bits and thrown together and other different elements, and they could get thrown on as amendments and everything like that. Why do we think that kind of compromise measure, and keep in mind it was part of a larger transportation package that included the jet fuel tax, why was that not taken up in the Senate? Is it just not far enough?
Yeah, I don't know if I understand the question.
The transportation package that included the compromise of the airport takeover, where we're not going to do a takeover, but we will do an oversight committee and we will put the right people on it and do things like that. Is it just not far enough for what the Senate is trying to accomplish there?
I have a one-word response: sausage.
Yeah.
Going back to what we talked about last week, this is sausage. This is conference committee negotiations. This is back and forth. This is, I will stand firm on this. I'm not backing your bill. You're not backing mine. This is just negotiations that are made public, which should never happen. I mean, legislators should never talk to members of the press during a session. There should be like a 40-day blackout. So
That's great.
I think the two journalists at this table have something to say
Yeah,
about
the
that.
I
two
don't know about
journalists
that one.
and someone who likes to read a
Yeah.
lot are all
Just-
saying that accountability is at least
Yeah,
mildly important.
because you just don't. There's so many different rumors and angles that things are taking, and it just never actually results in anything.
But this is not a This is not a rumor. This is not a statement. This is a large piece of
It
legislation
is.
that included a lot of things that a lot of people want. And I have a feeling not having a firm number on it, that the House wouldn't have taken up the airport takeover measure at all. So them putting in the oversight committee element of it, for them, this is the compromise. This is us meeting you halfway.
No, and it's a good compromise. It reminds me of we've spoken about this before, that things can be compromised. You can find ways to compromise. There's not a good movie called Hoffa, starring Jack Nicholson as Hoffa and Danny DeVito as whatever the heck he was. It's not
DeVito?
Danny DeVito. Well, he was a fictional character, so I don't. His right-hand man. And it's not a great movie, but there's a lot of great quotes in it from Hoffa. And one of them is that he says, look, differences can be resolved. You can work things out. What you just can't do is you can't upset the person. You can't slight them, was the word he used. But I always remember that because it shows that there's always a middle ground. There's a way to rework something. You didn't want to take over the board? Fine. We'll take a baby step and we'll do an oversight. We'll take that step. And as long as the oversight has teeth, that's the problem. Martok has no teeth. People keep using this Martok analogy. Well, it doesn't. They don't do anything.
Sure. The Democrats fighting against the oversight committee certainly made it feel like it did have teeth, because there were some Democrats saying this by itself is even too far. So, which certainly gave the impression to the people on the other side of the chamber, like, okay, this is part of that measure that we wanted.
Sure.
It is difficult. You were saying you just can't upset the person. You just can't slight them.
Yeah.
It is difficult for the Senate, and I do differentiate between the House and the Senate this way, as I'm sure you would too, being a historian almost. The Senate is very dominated by personality, and I think they do feel a little slighted that this hasn't been taken up, and that their measure to kind of hostage the jet fuel tax maybe didn't work. And it looks to me right now like it's going to get pushed into next year, and by that point their prominence of the people have just gone to jail from the airport might have gone away by that, and we may not be talking about this again.
You've seen it yourself, that if the Senate doesn't feel that the House is moving fast enough on a certain bill or even a vague number of bills, suddenly the Senate Rule Committee stops meeting.
Sure.
And vice versa. Both sides do this. There is no reason why they can't do that until 11 o'clock on day 40. I mean, this is truly the ultimate stare down game.
Sure. It's chicken. Yeah. Who's going to move first?
Yeah, exactly. It happens every year.
And because of that, I might be at work until 3 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. So, but that's good.
You're going to be the guy who climbs up there and moves the hands on the clock?
Oh, that's such a great
It is
picture.
a great I want
to explain that because it's so great. There is a photo on the 4th floor of the Capitol of a legislator leaning over the House gallery, which is quite a steep drop where he'd be pretty seriously injured, and trying to move the hands on the clock because they had hit a deadline. I don't know if it worked.
It is a great photo. The court ruled on it. I think they ruled that the legislature is basically servants of their own time. So if they wanted to go past 12 midnight, they very well can.
That's the most Georgia Capitol thing I've ever heard, servants of their own time. Yeah.
Something like that. Right?
Okay, let's do some quick hitters since we're getting a little tight on time here. But of course, our biggest quick hitter, the House budget. It passed. Under the original teacher pay raise format, which is I think the thing is being most written about right now, which is $3,000. The House I think amended it to $2,775, but went back to $3,000. I think it had a good amount of support, as budgets usually do. They're usually not hugely divisive, at least not by the final vote. During the process, they certainly are, but that passed through.
How did Matt Gertler vote?
No.
No, you want to answer that? Or no, that's how he voted.
No, that's how he voted. I think I want to tread carefully here. There is a section of, I think, both parties that the very nature of the House budget is going to make them vote no. Just the very nature of a House budget almost existing and how it is made, they're just going to vote no regardless of what's in it. So, but anyways.
Well said.
The Bible bill. We got this as a question on Twitter, actually, and I think it's an interesting thing to talk about, at least for a second. Craig is shaking his head no. He doesn't want to talk about it.
No, it's not that I don't want to talk about it. It's the fact that someone would find it interesting to talk about.
A bill passed the legislature this past week that allows schools in Georgia to teach the Bible as an elective. Now, we can talk about what that means for those of us who haven't been in school for a little while. I said us. I've been in school recently, but it's not required that someone would have to take it to graduate. What a lot of people leave out from some reporting is that you can already pretty much teach the Bible in Georgia public school right now I think there are more specifications on the kind of context you have to give to it, and this might be a little bit vaguer, but this is not a massive step up. So to a lot of the people who are very upset by this, I understand, but you should have also been upset a couple weeks ago before this had been bad, because this is not totally new, and we're not totally outliers in this. But
what are the
So
differences?
is the difference that rather than learning about the Bible in a history class, that you get a class dedicated to it? Is that the difference?
I don't want to tear apart your syntax, but the Bible as a history class is how you could have learned it in the past.
As a history class?
Not as a replacement for your history class, but as a separate thing. So this doesn't mean that during history class that is required to graduate, we're going to go through and talk about all of the Old Testament and New Testament. You already could, and you already can right now, take an elective that puts the Bible through historical and I think literary context. So like you can look at the Psalms and how beautifully they're written and all this other stuff. So
what's the difference?
the difference now is that you remove some of that context, and you can teach it as, maybe somebody will fight against this term, but you can teach it as allegory. And I don't know if that's completely accurate, but you can leave the historical context and start talking about the moral context, which is, I think, where a lot of people thinks it gets particularly tricky, and that people think the schools now leave their neutral or neutrality zone that they're supposed to operate in as public schools.
So is the some of those decisions, are they still left up to the school system itself?
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't think this bill will affect. I think this bill will affect the schools it was already affecting, right? I think the schools that were already having Bible as an elective will now up their game, and I think the schools that weren't will not.
I can't think of a worse class I'd ever want to teach than try to teach that Bible class, because the line between trying to teach it as history versus proselytizing
Sure, it's trapeze.
is so vague, so gray, so wide. There's no way you'd be able to say anything in that class without somebody objecting and it becoming seen as proselytizing. I mean, from a big picture perspective, I can see the value of teaching the Bible as a source for the Judean Christian ethics system that has governed Western Europe, since 358, AD 350.
Sure.
But you get anything more where you start getting to that proselytizing point, boy, you're tough. And there are different Bibles too. Which one are you going to teach?
Yeah, I know.
I'm a good lapsed Catholic. My Bible is different than a Baptist's Bible.
Yeah, my Bible has
So
pictures.
I don't know what Bible would you teach?
What about other religious scriptures?
True.
Are those decisions also available to a school system, or is it just the Bible?
I would imagine, to cover themselves, I would imagine they would spend some time on the Torah at least,
Sure.
discussing how the Torah's rules help set up that Judean Christian ethics
Right.
system. But I think if you moved beyond that,
But if
you're
the law-
setting yourself
if
up
the
for
law
one heck of a lawsuit.
Says the Bible, and the law doesn't say something vague like religious
I guess
text.
that was
That's-
kind of my question.
Is
Well,
it
this
that
is-
against the First Amendment?
Well, remember, the Jewish faith, the Old Testament is...
Yeah, but
is
there's the
Is the
Quran,
class
there's-
called
But, okay.
Religion 101, or is it called the Bible 101?
A lot of I think you guys are stuck on maybe a different element. I think a lot of the legal challenges are dodged because of it being an elective, in the same way that when you go to college, underwater basket weaving is an elective. So I'm not the legal expert here, but I would assume that because it's an elective, you are now having a student or the parent on behalf of that student make an active choice to put yourself in this situation. So
I'm not making an active choice to have my taxpayer dollars go to it, though.
That's also a good point.
I'm still curious if it's called Religion 101 or the Bible 101.
My guesses would be the latter.
Our producer Daniel's going to look it up. He's going to let us know before the end of the show.
I mean, everybody
has 10
learns
seconds.
their
Thanks, Daniel.
everybody learns their religious faith differently. I mean, I learned more about religion in my AP European history class taught down the road here at Centennial High School. I learned more there than I did in X number of years of Catholic Sunday school.
And what you're
everybody's
saying-
experience is different.
What you're saying about the background of basically entire law sets of Western civilization being based on that, I think people talk about that already now in all sorts of classes. Um,
And
you
you
know,
mentioned literary. It's pretty
I was gonna
difficult to
mention
talk
that.
about any Western literature without talking about the Bible
Sure.
to some degree.
Sure. So
It's
I'm gonna
so
go back
dangerous,
to
though.
I'm gonna go back to what I
Why
said
you
at the
touch
beginning
that?
is that if you are, if you are protesting on the internet now, you also should have been protesting on the internet a couple weeks ago. But I do think, this could have some interesting
There's-
implications. And you're right, taxpayer dollars
To
will
be
be going
fair,
to this at
There's,
least a
there's
little
only
bit more.
so many things you can protest at once. They only have so many hours in the day.
Yeah.
They've been protesting other things.
And to be fair, those not protesting may not have those classes in their school system, so they may not have been as aware of what the law already
Sure. And should we
stated.
talk more about local control? What if a community really wants this to be offered in their school system?
Oh, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
It seems very specifically based on the Bible class.
Ah.
It's a Bible
Any
class.
community
Bible,
still
not
has to follow
religious.
the Constitution.
That's true. I believe that does govern most of us.
Are you sure? We did just pass a heartbeat bill, so
Okay,
I'll
okay,
leave that to
okay.
the
Hey,
courts.
hey, okay. All right. Last one for this section. Senate Bill 106, the Medicaid waiver package, passed out of the House. It is going to the governor's desk. He will certainly sign it. We've talked on a much earlier episode about what it says. I'm going to go through again and talk about what it says because it will only take a couple seconds. But it applies for two waivers with the federal government, an 1115 and a 1332. The only specification about what the new Medicaid program would look like is that it will cover up to 100% of the poverty line. Now, it could cover 95% of the poverty line, but it cannot go above 100. Medicaid expansion, which has been talked about by the Democrats, including Stacey Abrams in her last campaign, covers 138% of the poverty line. And under current law, that is how you get the 90 cents to 10 cents match from the federal government. There have been plans similar to what this package at least vaguely hints at that have applied for that 90-10 match and not gotten it. So Republicans were for the waiver package in the sense that having a step forward is better than nothing. Democrats were against it because they didn't even see this as a step forward. They saw it as one step forward, two steps back. Minority Leader Trammell says it would be more expensive because of that 90-10 match. It would cover less people, and it would provide worse coverage overall because it only inserts the most vulnerable population. So I don't know how long we want to spend on this. This is something we've been talking about for a long time, and nobody ever thought I think it was going to fail. The governor has to come up with a plan and put it in front of us by July 1st, 2020.
I still vividly remember the debate that I had in this room X number of weeks ago when this thing first passed. So I'm pretty content with my answers back then.
You want to give me a little refresher?
Well, I was having a debate with two Democratic consultants. So at the time, my whole point was basically, hey, take a victory lap, guys, because they were very upset that, and you were rather upset as well, that the bill didn't include every detail known to man about Medicare fixes. And I said, look, you won the argument in the gubernatorial race. This was one of the first bills that Kemp was pushing forward. It shows that Kemp has a priority on this. Take the victory that you affected the issue and work in the future on what's going to be decided.
I'm not a fan of moral victories. Just because we moved the window of
You're
discussion
gonna
a little
hate
bit.
politics, man.
Oh, no, trust me, I'm in it.
You're gonna hate life and
I'm
politics.
in it. I understand it. But the thing is it's not just so much the package of what the bill is in. This removes the legislature's ability to have input. And that, I thought, should be more of a unifying idea for everybody, for those who didn't want to expand the program at all and weren't in favor of spending more money, and those who wanted the program to be expanded more. The more unifying idea of us of the people's chamber not having input, I thought would help. But, it didn't.
Let me phrase it this way: are you a legislative defender because the governor is a Republican, or are you a legislative defender on a case of ideology?
No, I'm saying I don't know how to
It's
answer.
similar to local control.
Let me answer your
right?
question. Let me answer your question
Well,
this
no,
way.
because the same person votes for Angelica Kausa who votes for Brian Kemp.
Let me answer your question this way. Let's venture into a hypothetical for a moment that Stacey Abrams is governor.
Sure.
And that the Democratic primary conversation is centered around Medicare for all. And there is a hint that a similar package gets passed, that the Medicaid waiver just passed, that's vague, that gives pretty much ultimate authority to the governor, and people are thinking, what if instead of regular Medicaid expansion, and again, this is all hypothetical, she comes back with a Medicaid for all program or Medicare for all program that the legislature then has no say over. It is enacted and it is done. I thought if that was going to happen, that would be a very unifying thing across the ideological spectrum that, listen, let's have this conversation. Let's get into the weeds here. Let's talk about what a program can look like, but you can't cut us out from the table because we need to be able to come back and you said this is too much or this is too little. So I'm basically giving you the reverse scenario here.
Right. I'm just, and that's fine. It's just, once again, going back to my previous statement about ideology trumping process. I don't know how many Democrats would be upset if a Democrat, Stacey Abrams, passed a similar bill giving the governor all authority, because the argument that this Governor Abrams' staff would have made was, look, we might lose the legislature in 2 years. I'm here for 4, and I got a better chance of winning re-elect in 22 than we have of holding the legislature for the next 6 years. So I don't know. I mean, I
have a question for you.
Yes.
Would this allow for, again, your hypothetical, a future Governor Abrams to reverse that decision unilaterally and do exactly what you just said?
So the legislature a while ago, maybe like a little over a decade ago, back when Obamacare was first passed, the ACA was first passed, said that if the governor wanted to apply for Medicaid waivers, they had to go through the legislature. So this is Brian Kemp coming to the legislature and basically asking permission to apply for 2 waivers. But those 2 waivers don't contain a lot of specifics that a lot of members of the legislature wanted to see. So would that give ultimate authority for Stacey Abrams to do whatever she wanted? No, it would give her the authority to apply for an 1115 waiver and a 1332 waiver. If you want to go Medicaid expansion, a waiver is a way to not do that.
Okay.
So no, if she wanted to expand Medicaid, she could expand Medicaid.
Sure.
The 1115 allows you to expand along the poverty line, and the 1332 allows you to try innovative experimental techniques with the insurance market. If you don't understand what that means, it's because nobody else does either. So that's what I'm saying. But no, it would not grant ultimate authority to the next governor just for those two waivers, which she wouldn't want to apply for waivers anyways.
Right. Okay.
All right.
I mean, I just want to say something. As you pointed out, very, very few people actually understand the technical aspects of the Affordable Care Act, of Medicaid waivers. So I think this is a good thing for Republicans that it passed, because it shows that they're not tone deaf, that they heard that the Democrats made healthcare a big part of their campaigns this election season. And it's going to be harder to demonize, if you want to use that word, Republicans come next election, because they're going to say, I voted for Medicaid waivers.
You're almost checking the box. Yeah.
I'm working to expand it and doing it in a more fiscally responsible way than Democrats would have.
It became, and I mentioned this when we discussed this the first time around, the healthcare as a partisan political issue really took steam in the 90s with Hillary and Bill Clinton getting into the healthcare debate. The Democratic Party has decided what their answer to that is. That's Medicare for all. The Republicans are still struggling to see what their answer to this issue is. And you're seeing that struggle now in the legislation by giving this authority incrementally to see what kind of approach they can have. Now, if you want to fall for the GOP for not having a healthcare answer, then I think it's a valid criticism. But I think that's what the underlying big tone picture is.
Okay. The Democratic answer to healthcare is not Medicare for all. You only have to look at the presidential race right now to know out of the 14 candidates, I think half maybe have said that. 3 more have said public option, and then 3 more have just said we need to strengthen existing ACA. So I don't think that's the complete party platform.
I think let's bring that back in August of 2020. Let's see who wins, and let's see how that argument evolves. You could have somebody like Biden, for example, who doesn't believe it, but has been pushed so hard on the issue that he's all the way up, except for calling it that. I think that's what might happen. We'll come back to that.
It'll be a big part of the 2020
primary.
It's going to be a huge issue. But to say that the jury's decided,
I
don't
actually
think
agree
we're
with
there.
you to a certain extent, Craig. I think one of the takes I heard recently is that the Democratic Party is in favor of Medicare for all. It's the debate is how fast do we get there, and whether it's incremental steps.
I'd buy that. Sure.
But I want to go back to one thing Carson touched on real quick. That yes, I do agree that this is sort of maybe an olive branch from the governor's office to make an incremental change. But I'll go back to the idea that by not expanding Medicaid throughout the state, it remains a political football in 2020.
And I think that's the poker hand they're playing, right? Is
Right.
whether or not that is true. I think a lot of people within the party within the Republican Party are not going to abandon them because, like Carson said, they will be able to come back and say, we're taking steps towards expanding it.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not they can say
it'll still be a political football. I'm saying it'll be harder. Democrats can't say they don't have a plan. They don't care
Yeah.
about these people that are underneath the poverty line. Republicans will say, we do have a plan. This is our plan. And Democrats will have to say, well, here's why that's a bad plan. And they have to get into the weeds. And that is a hard position to be in.
and
It's
the,
also going to sell much better in the so-called swing districts, which everybody now comments on a daily basis of what's a swing district.
whether the Republicans will be able to campaign on it being more fiscally responsible remains to be seen, because a lot of people don't think so. Because that 9 to 10 match at Medicaid expansion is so huge. I mean,
That's a debate for a
I know, but
Republican
Republicans are
primary.
gonna
That's not.
say it
That's not
is.
a debate in November.
I know, but Carson had mentioned they'd be able to go around saying we're taking the fiscally responsible approach to this, and they might be able to say that, and I'm certain some will try, but a plan like this has not been matched at the 9 to 10 rate yet.
I was just saying that they'll say that.
Yeah, okay.
I wouldn't say whether or not it's true.
Sure. I guess if you include the federal government, then it is more fiscally responsible. But most people want. Anyways, let's
Most
move
conservatives would.
on. Let's move on. Bills that could come up tomorrow, as we mentioned at the top of the show. Tomorrow is the deadline. It is sine die sine die. It is the second one was right.
Sine die.
Sine die.
It's
It is
5
the
years
last.
of Latin. 5 years of Latin talking here. I always hated.
How
when,
often do you have to use
I
that?
always hated when Tom Murphy would. God, that
I
accent
hear
of
it called
his.
sign die all the time.
And he just, oh man, I wanted to throw something at him every time he said "sine die." It was just
So-
skin crawl.
Deadline
Sine
day
die.
comes up tomorrow. A lot of the bigger ticket items, I guess we'll call them, have already been taken care of. It is very possible, if not likely, will still be there until the wee hours of the morning. But there are only a couple things that you could see extensive debate on. Let's talk about this one first. The members of the Gwinnett delegation, not all of them, some of them, have attached a rule to I don't even remember what piece of legislation it was attached to right now, but they've attached an amendment that says Gwinnett County cannot vote again on the MARTA issue for 7 years. The members of the delegation who did this have done it this way because they have a majority in the legislature, and they do not have a majority in the Gwinnett delegation where this could otherwise be put forward. So they know their numbers, they're playing the game. What's the logic behind delaying the vote for another 7 years?
From whose perspective?
From the perspective of the people who brought this forward.
Because they know that it would pass in a regular referendum.
Well, I
Can
remember.
I ask a technical question?
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm not an expert in this issue, but there's a question of whether public transportation could have been expanded by Gwinnett County partnering with MARTA, right? There's also a question of whether it'll be expanded under the ATL. Would this prohibit just another referendum exactly like the one we just saw, or could an ATL referendum
A different authority present a different plan?
Sure, they could.
Yeah,
They
but
could.
I
Focus
think
just on
So
Gwinnett.
that's maybe a too tactical of a
well,
question.
no, as far as I know, it's transportation, like taxes that go towards transportation expansion referendums. That generality.
Okay.
I think I'm 90% sure on that. So I think it would, if the ATL did bring a plan forward, would also exclude that.
Okay.
I'm reminded of something that Hans had said when we first discussed this a couple weeks ago, is whether or not there was going to be this large element in Gwinnett County who is tired of having this thing constantly brought up over and over again. You know, the man's jamming this down my throat. He's just going to keep putting on the ballot until it wins.
That was going to be my non-cynical take.
Yeah,
was
that might be part of that element, but there's also an element to it that they're afraid that it might win. Sure, it can be both.
I'm still curious about the 7 years.
Why
that
why
particular
7
state?
years?
7 years?
I don't think.
Is it?
I haven't
because
heard
Brian
any
Kemp-
logic behind the number 7.
Brian Kemp has 7 years
has
left.
7 years left
Well,
if he gets a second term.
26 would be the gubernatorial year after he's.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
I
don't know.
mean, it seemed I
Or-
definitely empathize with the point that voters
see
could
we're
get
doing
tired of the referendum, but it seems to me like that is a decision that Gwinnett,
That Gwinnett
County
could
could
make too. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
again, it falls back to this local, the local thing,
Right.
You know, but we would not have a city of Sandy Springs if this particular tact had not been utilized. I don't know anybody here remembers how Sandy Springs became a city. It was the legislature, which was Republican run, finding an end way around the local legislative process so the Dems in Fulton County could stop it. So yeah, does it not necessarily pass the amateur smell test? Sure. But this is a practice that can have both a positive and a negative result, and it's not necessarily uncommon.
Sure. I definitely see that point, but I still struggle. I struggle with that people in Savannah are going to try and predict what the Gwinnett voters will feel in the fall of 2020. And I think, the comments from, is it Chairwoman Nash?
Yes.
Okay, the comments from Chairwoman Nash after the vote saying we're looking at the next time we can put it on, I think has caused this kind of jolt of we have to make sure it doesn't get on a 2020 ballot. Or I don't buy that the people putting this on there, we have to make sure that the voters aren't getting tired of this, getting so tired. I mean, like, we're about to have a presidential election where every candidate on the Democratic side is going to come to Gwinnett. Like, are you really that concerned about the voters in Gwinnett County getting so tired that you're going to go outside your delegation because you would lose on this vote in the delegation? And they immediately mobilized and put together a press conference and said, this is not a delegation move. This is the minority part of the delegation trying to do this. I guess that's all I'm saying is I just don't buy it.
Well, because the timing of referendums is always strategic.
Sure.
Whoever gets to control that decision is going to be strategic about when they do it. If it's on a main election, if it's off a main election, how many years since the last referendum. So the people who are pro public transportation expansion are going to make, if they want another referendum, they're going to be strategic about when it is. And one of the things that's factoring into that strategy is sort of election exhaustion and whether people are tired of hearing about it. So,
And I know we have beat this to death over the last few episodes, but I think this might be the most egregious example of state officials just shredding local control. And I'd
At
like
least
to,
the people bringing this forward are from Gwinnett.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
Yeah.
yay.
Yeah.
So I take what you're saying, but I don't know if I would say it's the most egregious example because they're at least from the place they're trying to govern.
Well, I
essentially.
say that in the sense that they're literally telling the people of Gwinnett, you can't vote on what you want to vote on if you wanted to vote on it. And, I mean, there's nothing more democratic than voting on issues that are important to you.
It might be seen as a way of sanctifying. Is not the word I'm using. It may legitimatize one vote over another. I'm going back to that quote saying that that this was voter suppression. That the election last month was voter suppression. This might be an attempt, or some of the thinking might be that this is a way of us showing, no, it's not. One vote has to be respected. One vote has to be legitimatized. Simply because you dislike the result of a vote, you can't simply run and put it on the ballot again. An election has a meaning and it should have a shelf life, for a better term.
Sure.
Now that might, I mean, that's really stretching things out.
Sure.
I recognize that, but I think that's a legitimate concern that you could have an honest debate about. And it goes back to the same thing: you're going to put it on the ballot until you get the answer right. Well, I don't know.
But the
There's a
debate
point there.
doesn't belong there. That's my biggest problem. The debate doesn't belong in the state capitol. It belongs at the county, who it will be affected by.
Well, wait a minute. Every bit of local legislation is voted on by the whole General Assembly and signed by the
But
governor.
it goes through the local delegation
Yes,
for the most part.
It does, but it's still yes. But if a senator from Cobb wanted to vote against something that was happening in Toombs County, he can. It's just an understanding that you don't.
Sure. I just
And the governor can refuse to. He vetoes bill half the bills. I think last time Governor Deal, he vetoed had a local legislative element to it. There was one where Clayton County wanted to form some sort of authority. And he said no, because if they form this authority, it's in violation of OCJ, blah blah blah. No, I mean your point is well founded. I mean it doesn't pass a smell test, at first thought, but it's not revolutionary.
Can you just edit out the part, everything you said that wasn't your point is well founded, and just leave that? Okay, thank you for that quote, Craig, and now we're going to move on.
Excellent.
That's right.
So the people who get to vote on this will probably be debating on it tomorrow unless it gets removed, which is unlikely. So we will hear about it tomorrow. The next issue that could come up tomorrow, school vouchers or education opportunity scholarships. I don't want to get too much in the weeds here. From the practical angle, it probably will pass. There are even some Democrats that I know of who are probably going to cross over and vote for it. Democrats will do
Betsy
the
Holland?
absolute. I don't know that Betsy Holland. I'm not ready to name names before I can come back with facts.
She lives in an HG with a lot of people who take their kids to private school.
Sure,
But I'm just saying.
good for them. Okay.
So does a couple other new Dems who
Sure. I mean,
in
we can
North
get
Fulton.
listen. We're on an hour and 10 minutes right now, as far as I can tell.
You're the moderator here, man. not
I
me.
know, which is why I'm trying to move us on. But I don't. We can get into it off the air. We can get into it after it passes.
I'm not prepared. I basically just told you everything I know. So
I'm just trying to tell our listeners that if they're wondering what could still come up at the last minute, that is one of them, and that would probably be likely to pass after 1 to 2 hours of limited debate. That's all I want to say about it, because I will talk for hours. All right, let's close up with what we are watching in the next week of news. This is probably the hardest what we're watching I've done, because the session's going to be over and I'm getting out of town. I will be in Virginia and DC. So because of that theme, I'm going to stick with the aid package for Hurricane Michael is still up in the air right now.
Here.
I understand Democrats' concerns, whether they come from, wanting more aid for Puerto Rico or wanting more aid for other places. My main takeaway from this story is that it is the what do you call it? The furthest rail. It is the last rail of politics, whatever it is. Third rail.
You touch it, you die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That we have now politicized aid for places.
Hell,
And
everything's politicized. That's why this is such a terrible time to.
And I understand that, but
politically.
it's just disappointing. Puerto Rico should have incredibly more help than they have right now, absolutely, and so should Georgia. And the fact that these two things, and California, and the fact that these things have gotten all tangled up in a web of something we get to yell and tweet about is a bummer. So I hope that comes soon. I know the entire Georgia delegation is doing what they can, and I hope it comes soon, because they got some help in the beginning, but boy, there's still a lot of communities in Southwest Georgia that are struggling right now. Some of the banks haven't even reopened yet, and it's a nightmare. So on that happy note, somebody hit me with their next one.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll throw in HB 276, which is basically the Uber Lyft tax bill that has been gone around and has changed versions many times. I got a very quick briefing on this morning, and it's Uber and Lyft don't want to fall under this sales tax issue. I have been advised that the sales tax has actually been accrued. What this bill requires is that Uber and Lyft actually take it.
Yeah.
what's the word?
Start
the verb.
paying it,
The
yeah.
verb. I'm forgetting the verb.
Honor it.
Honor it. Take
Yeah.
it. Accrue it. Whatever the word is. So that's a big thing that I'm looking at. And then lastly, and I'll shut up. I want to see if there's any more fallout on what happened in Savannah over the next week regarding the mayor's debate. That's an issue that did get some national press. So I
Can
don't
you
want
fill
to be
our listeners in?
Oh, I'm sorry. This was where there's a mayor's race in Savannah at the end of the year. Savannah is a majority black city. However, they have a white mayor. There are 3 African American candidates who are thinking of challenging this mayor, and a African American minister has put forward a conversation that only one African American should run, and they need to figure out a way to get the other 2 to drop out. And they held an event at a church, and where they put up signs on the windows saying "Black press only," and they made it very clear that only African Americans were allowed into this room. No recording, no nothing, and you had to be an African American to be in the room.
Wow.
And the Savannah Morning News had a couple white reporters. I presume they were white reporters, and they were not allowed in. And they took photos and everybody who walked in, they put a microphone in their face and said, "What do you think about this?" And it turned into a national story.
Wow.
I just want to see if there'll be more fallout from that, because you want to talk about George in a bad light. We can compare it to other things that puts George in a bad light, but a lot of ways I think this is worse. But that's me.
Sure. I'll go next. Actually, I'm going to plug a couple things. I had the opportunity to take my son, who just turned 2, to the Atlanta Zoo
Uh-huh.
this weekend. We went on Saturday, which was beautiful, and I guess we kind of made the mistake of going on the first day of spring break, so
Ooh,
it was
boy.
packed.
Ooh.
But I hadn't been to the zoo in a while, and I was very impressed. They're doing a great job over there. But outside of that, weather's looking nice, and there's a lot of nonprofits and fun events. I know there's a photo exhibit out in Johns Creek that Carson wrote about.
Mhm.
That would be great to attend. Support your local arts. Georgia Ensemble Theater has some stuff going on in Roswell. And if you want to check out a calendar of some of those events, you can go to northfulton.com/calendar.
Shameless self
I know.
promotion.
Shameless self.
We're in the studio. You might
I
as well,
know,
might as well
yeah.
shameless.
Yeah, we're in your building. You can do whatever you want.
What are they doing with the building where the cyclorama was?
It is, I believe, under construction.
They completely gutted,
I think
destroyed
so.
the building.
Yeah,
rebuilt it.
yeah.
What's going to go there?
I
Townhomes,
don't
apartments?
know.
It's a great spot.
I don't know.
It is a great spot.
Yeah,
I
for
don't know
that.
what's going there
Yeah.
either.
All right, my turn. I was asked to be on this podcast 10 minutes before we started recording.
Oh yeah,
So
I
I
should
don't,
mention that.
I
that's
don't have
a
a prepared
good-
answer.
thank you for
if
showing
this is a
up.
bad
Thank you for
answer, don't be mean to me. Then this isn't really something I'm watching this week or this legislative session, just sort of in general, and that's gerrymandering. It's an interesting issue to follow always. I know there was just cases before the Supreme Court about it, but my thinking is if we're going to head into an election that's going to decide who gets to draw the maps, and neither side can say with absolute certainty that they're going to come out on top. You can debate who's favored and to what degree they're favored.
Mhm.
But I would think if you are someone who is in favor of redistricting reform, this would be the time to try and get something done about it, rather than if you're headed into an election where one side knows with absolute certainty they're going to win.
That's a good point.
I'm interested if anyone else shares that line of thinking, and if so, what they're pushing for, because there's a lot of nuance into what different kinds of gerrymandering reform could look at. But that's something I'm always on the lookout for.
Wow, the last thing on the broadcast, you just opened up
I
something
know.
we have
Let's
three
go, Craig.
we have
Let's hear
three
it, Craig.
broadcasts about. Oh my.
The Pandora's box.
Oh
yeah.
my! Yeah, where's my map that showed the last time the Democrats drew the
Well,
lines in the
listen.
state?
Can
Good
we
God.
not agree on a nonpartisan thing then?
Agree to it?
Like,
It's
can
been-
we have a
it's-
nonpartisan
I didn't
commission
mean
draw
to
the
start
map?
this.
It's been a political process since they drew the lines.
Right.
So
So
Madison and Monroe had to go up against each
So
other in a
do-
house race.
doesn't make
So
it
do
right.
something about it. Have a nonpartisan commission draw the map
Well, there are
based
some,
on the science.
there are some states that do that.
Right.
And what was it? Was it California, I think, where they did that? It was pushed by the Democrats. They were all ticked off, so they passed it. And then they realized the map, oh my God, it doesn't do what we wanted it to do. And they tried to undermine it.
So make it binding.
I'm,
Make it
I'm
binding.
asking you a yes or no question if a nonpartisan commission would satisfy.
Would satisfy me?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Just the Republicans doing it?
Well,
Would that
no,
satisfy you?
I'm speaking for myself. No, I don't think
What
it's.
would
California's
satisfy-
I don't
system
think
is
it's a
actually a lot
solution for
more
what people
complicated
want.
than a nonpartisan commission. So there's a lot of different possible. I don't want to say solutions because some people would argue gerrymandering isn't a problem, but a lot of possible alternative ways to do redistricting. There's computer formulas, there's nonpartisan commissions. California has this whole process where they determine what a community means. It's a whole thing. 538 did a whole series about about gerrymandering. That's interesting if this is something you're interested in. So I didn't mean to start a debate over it.
No.
I'm just saying that's something I'm watching.
No, you're trying to bring us back to reality while Craig and I are trying to throw punches. Yeah. So,
She
should end it there.
She should have known better.
well,
She's from a state with some really interesting maps.
this
too.
this being the appropriately the last episode of the legislative session. This is obviously the first session we've covered as the Georgia Politics Podcast. I want to thank everybody for listening and sharing. We will be around after session is over. We will not go away. The form we come back in is something that has to be decided, but we are
TBD.
not going away.
You make it sound like a Frankenstein movie or
Sort
something.
of, yeah. We're going to die and be reborn as something else. But, I am super excited to have a 3-hour episode on gerrymandering in a couple weeks.
I'm
So
in favor of it. Let's
everybody
do it.
get prepared for that. But in the meantime, thank you everybody for listening and sharing. Subscribe to the show, follow us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter, do everything you need to do. But the day before deadline day, where I will not be sleeping, this is Preston Thompson for all of our hosts signing off. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
That's fun.
Oh, I know. I'm really excited. I'm very excited.